7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
You'll never have the sacred stone.
Hello everybody, I am your host Ashton, and welcome back to The Sound of Fear, the show where we break down the sounds that make your blood run cold. It's our job to find out which songs bring the fear and which songs fall flat. In today's episode, we're going to be covering the pain and pleasure in Clive Barker's Hellraiser. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and let's get right into it. The film opens at a market in Morocco where we see a man with the dirtiest fingernails known to mankind by a very strange looking box. We cut to a dark room where the man is conducting some sort of ritual with our first track titled Lament Configuration. The man fiddles with the cube, eventually finding a way to separate its pieces. Once he finally solves the cube, fish hooks fly out of the cube and embed themselves in his skin. Something tells me YouTube isn't going to like this movie. The composer for the music in this movie was Christopher Young. Young is best known for his works in the Hellraiser franchise, with him doing the scores for the first two movies, along with Nightmare on Elm Street 2: Freddy's Revenge. His work spreads over 5 decades, with him also doing the score for 2012's Sinister. The film cuts to the outside of a quiet and unassuming home, but you can quickly tell that something isn't right. Upstairs, we slowly enter a room to find chains and grotesque obelisks hanging from the ceiling. Blood and viscera cover the floors. Tall, pale figures stand in the darkness as one picks up the cube from earlier and begins to solve it. The instant the cube is solved, everything is back to normal. Just as the events in the attic end, someone unlocks the front door, this being Larry Cotton and his wife Julia. Larry explains how this is an old family home and he always wanted to sell it, but his brother Frank would never let him. The house is a mess, and Julia rightfully protests Larry's idea to move in here. Upstairs, the couple finds that someone's been living here for a while before they took off. Larry explains it must have been his brother Frank before hearing the phone ring downstairs. Picking up the phone, we hear Kirsty, Larry's daughter. She explains that she was able to find a place to stay in order to come and visit them at their new house. Back upstairs, Julia is scrounging through a pile of Frank's things when she finds a stack of photos. This is when it's revealed to us that Frank was the man who solved the cube and was killed at the beginning of the movie. Julia heads downstairs and tells Larry she's made up her mind and she's okay with staying in the house. We cut to a few days later to see them officially moving in. Larry and a couple of moving guys are trying to force a mattress up the stairs. They look like a Three Stooges episode. One of the movers asks Julia if they've got any beer, like they're good friends. He doesn't even say please either, and the whole time they're just checking her out. We next see these beautiful shots of Kirsty walking down by the harbor with our next track titled Resurrection. Kirsty finally arrives at the house, and right as she steps in through the front door, she starts getting hit on by that same asshole from earlier. You're not even safe in your own house. We get to see Kirsty and her dad together for the first time in the movie, and she goes to check out the house while he goes back to trying to get that mattress moved up the stairs. As if that one moving guy couldn't get any worse, he says that Kirsty has her mom's looks, in reference to Julia, to which Larry responds with,
"My mother's dead."
Back upstairs, we see Julia looking at Frank's pictures again. While she is, our next track, rightfully titled Hellraiser, starts to play, and Julia is thrown into a flashback between her and Frank. This is where we find out that the two knew each other and where their crazy connection got its roots. Julia is snapped out of her memory by Kirsty, who's asking for a towel after getting sprayed by the faucet earlier. Kirsty tries to make small talk with Julia to try and be friends and be on good terms with her, but before she even realizes it, Julia is gone. Julia sneaks into the attic to continue her flashback and gives us our next track titled The Hellbound Heart. We see Frank coming on to Julia, and without a second thought, Julia folds immediately. Between the scenes of the flashback, we see Larry downstairs still trying to move that mattress, when his hand gets caught on a nail sticking out from the wall and gives him a pretty brutal cut. Through the flashbacks, we see Julia begging Frank to stay with her as she's decided that she'd do anything for him. Mind you, this is all happening the day before her and Larry's wedding. Just putting that out there. Breaking her out of her trance for the final time, Larry stumbles into the attic, holding his bloody hand, asking Julia for help. We get this really awkward dialogue between the two where Julia seems to hate Larry with every word she speaks to him. They decide that Larry needs stitches and rush him to the hospital, leaving the house abandoned for the time being. However, the attic doesn't stay quiet for very long, as we watch Larry's blood seep into the floorboards like it's getting absorbed. The shot slowly pans down below the floorboards and we hear a shallow heartbeat, before we see what looks to be a human heart beating on its own. I bet there's a tale or two to tell about that heart. The floorboards start to shake as we get our next track titled Re-Resurrection. Just as the music hits a climatic level, two arms, I guess, tear out of the floor as something begins to pull itself from the ground and back into our world. This is one of the most disgusting and awesome scenes in the horror genre. And all of it was done by special effects and makeup designer Bob Keane, who also worked on the original Candyman and Life Force. A very underrated movie, by the way. I cannot give enough credit to this scene, as in my many years of watching horror movies, this is the only scene where the practical effects rival that of The Thing. We cut to later in the night where the family is having a housewarming party with their friends. Larry is talking about his trip to the hospital, Kirsty watches her boyfriend Steve swallow a cigarette, and Julia looks like she wants to shoot everyone. Steve makes a sexual joke towards Kirsty, and her dad just gives him a look of, "Hell yeah, that's my boy, have sex with my daughter." Julia leaves, making the most awkward exit anyone has ever seen, when she hears a noise coming from the attic and heads upstairs to investigate. Julia enters the dark attic with the silence only broken by the faint beat of a heart. At the end of the attic, she sees a pile of flesh that the rats are eating off of. Before she can react, the creature grabs her leg and begins crawling after her as she screams for her life. This jump scare is accompanied by our next track titled Reunion. Trapping her in the attic, the living corpse talks, mentioning Julia's name. We also find out that the zombie is actually Frank. Frank explains how he came back to life and begs Julia to help him because living as a rotting corpse isn't very comfortable. Back downstairs, we see Kirsty drunkenly leaving the kitchen and begin to head upstairs with the track Reunion once again. From his hiding place in the attic, Frank explains to Julia that he needs more blood in order to get stronger and regain his body. It's at this point in the movie where I think of Julia in a very split way. As she is not a good person, as she cheats on her husband, and does some very evil things to come, she's also in this very strange relationship with her husband's brother, who is pretty abusive, and in almost all of their interactions, she's either scared or horrified with what she has done for him, but she can't seem to help herself. It's almost like Stockholm Syndrome where you fall in love with your captor. Kirsty runs into Julia on the stairs, and we get this really ominous shot where we can clearly see Julia considering giving Kirsty to Frank right then and there. But before Julia can say anything, Steve interrupts them, and he and Kirsty leave for the night. We cut to somewhere else in town where we see Kirsty and Steve walking together. Kirsty explains more about how she and Julia don't get along and that she prefers to stay away from her evil stepmother. While they're talking, however, we see a strange man staring at them from inside a building, seeming to be following them. The couple take a break from their walk and begin to make out in the dirtiest subway station known to man. I swear I've been here in the game Evil Within. Back at the house, we see Julia lying awake, remembering how she had promised she would do anything for Frank. She heads up into the attic to tell Frank that she's going to help him. She's accompanied by our next track titled Brought On By Night. We next get this very strange scene where Kirsty is in a room full of feathers. A table sits in the middle of the room with a body on it, covered in a blanket, almost like a funeral. However, this seemingly sad scene turns dark as the body begins to bleed, drenching the snow-white covers into a crimson red. While this is happening, in the background, we can hear the cries of a baby getting louder and louder as the body bleeds more. Kirsty grabs the blanket, pulling it off, only to see the mangled face of her father underneath, causing her to scream. Steve wakes up in Kirsty's apartment to her talking in her sleep about the nightmare she's having. Kirsty immediately calls her dad to make sure he's okay. With her mind being put to ease, they both go back to bed. However, not everyone's asleep. As we get this shot of Frank in the attic, it might just be the most badass, hardest, and coolest thing I have ever seen. The next morning, Julia gets all dressed up in her shoulder pads and sunglasses and heads to the airport, the perfect place to meet men who want to cheat on their wives. In no time at all, she wrangles a guy and brings him back to the family home, taking him up to the dingiest attic of all time, and all the guy has to say is, "This isn't a bedroom." The guy turns to go to the bathroom, but finds the door locked, and before he can realize what's happening, Julia smacks him in the back of the head with a hammer and beats him to death. We get a shot looking up at Julia covered in blood, along with our next track titled, "In Love's Name." Julia leaves the attic quickly so as not to see what Frank actually plans to do with the body. She washes herself off in the bathroom and heads back upstairs to see if Frank had gotten any better. She sees the mangled corpse of the man looking like the Thing, as well as the next step for Frank, being able to stand up and have more organs than he used to. Julia's obviously still terrified, and Frank starts to take advantage of her and get all feely with her. But before he can really do anything, Larry comes home and Julia runs to the bathroom to clean off the blood. Not before hiding the dead body, however. Larry tries talking to Julia from outside the bathroom door and says this really weird line.
"You want a cookie, little girl?"
I feel like Clive Barker exclusively writes the weirdest characters imaginable. Telling her husband that she'll meet him downstairs, Julia sneaks once again back up into the attic to talk to Frank, where he tells her that he's in extreme pain and asks for her to bring him more bodies so they can run away together. He also explains that there are things chasing him called the Cenobites, and that it won't be long before they find him. The Cenobites are the creatures from earlier in the film with the pale skin and the black leather outfits. Frank summoned them when he solved the cube, and they in turn killed him. We cut to see Kirsty at her new job, working at a pet store, dealing with some shitty customers and an old Karen, when she notices that same homeless guy from before who had been following her and Steve. As she confronts him, he turns around and we see him with handfuls of crickets as he's shoving them into his mouth. Obviously freaked out, Kirsty tells the guy he has to leave, and he gives her a creepy stare from the door, just as she's scared by Steve coming to see her for her lunch break. As she turns back, the homeless guy is gone. Our next track, titled "A Quick Death," starts to play as Julia brings another man to the house for Frank. Only this time, she's not scared, and a lot more cold-hearted about the killing. Frank is getting more and more human, as he's able to wear clothes and smoke cigarettes now. Despite this, Julia demands an explanation of everything happening to Frank, to which we get our first good look at the cube since the beginning of the movie. Frank explains that the cube opens doors to the pleasures of heaven or hell, and that he spent his life trying to find the limits of pleasure that humans could experience, and it led him to the box. He explains that the Cenobites gave him indescribable pain and pleasure, which overlapped as they became one. We get to see what they did to Frank after he opened the box, and it's crazy. I'm not even sure if you guys can see this because of YouTube, but I promise you it's crazy. Julia agrees to help Frank escape the Cenobites no matter what, and they will live happily ever after together as a couple of monster people. We see Julia and Larry watching boxing, which surprises Larry, as normally Julia doesn't like violence, to which she responds with,
"I've seen worse."
This is actually a reference to the fact that Julia is now evil and has killed people. Back upstairs, Frank is going wild, banging on the walls, assumedly because of the pain. Larry hears something and decides to go investigate. Julia tries to convince him not to go upstairs, but it doesn't work. As they ascend towards the attic, we get our next track titled "The Rat Slice Quartet." In the attic, Larry finds nothing and tells Julia that it was probably a rat. He's right, it was just a rat, but these ones happen to be hanging like my mom's landscape paintings. The two head back downstairs to their bedroom and start making love. To Julia's horror, however, she sees Frank slowly walk out of their closet with the same knife he had when he was alive. Julia starts begging for Frank not to kill Larry, and right as he makes it to the foot of their bed, he slices open a rat and leaves it there before hiding again. We next see Larry and Kirsty having dinner together, where Larry talks all about Julia and how weird she's been lately. He asks Kirsty to try and stop by and be friends with Julia to try and cool her nerves, to which Kirsty agrees. Back at the house, we get this short conversation between Julia and Frank, where Julia refuses to let Frank kill Larry, so instead, she heads out to get Frank one more body. Kirsty shows up to the house just in time to see Julia walking inside with a random man that Kirsty has never seen before. Immediately thinking that Julia is cheating on her father, Kirsty sneaks into the house accompanied by our next track titled Uncle Frank. Julia does her same cat and mouse routine of luring the guy into the attic, but this time, Frank doesn't stay hidden and takes care of the guy himself. Kirsty, hearing the commotion from outside, sneaks in through the kitchen, but Julia hears her coming and ducks into the dead body storage room. Kirsty ascends the stairs as slow as possible as to try and not make any noise. But right as she gets to the top, the attic door swings open with the guy Julia brought trying to escape. He is super messed up and honestly might look worse than Frank. Speaking of Frank, he comes out of hiding to deal with the guy and formally reintroduces himself to his niece Kirsty. In Frank's infinite creepiness, he starts threatening and coming on to Kirsty.
Come to daddy.
Get the fuck off of me!
But my goat won't take that line down. She literally pulls out Frank's intestines and grabs the cube, which he immediately reacts to. Realizing its importance, Kirsty chucks it out the window, giving her the chance to escape as Frank does the supervillain scream. On her run from the house, Kirsty grabs the box, just in case it truly is important. We see her run and run and run until her body gives out and she gets picked up and taken to the hospital. When Kirsty wakes up, she is questioned by the doctors, but all she can think about is calling her dad to warn him. That is, until the doctor pulls out the puzzle box and asks her what it's for. Finally alone in her room and unable to get out, Kirsty begins to mess with the cube to try and figure out what it is. Slowly, she begins to understand how the cube moves and accidentally solves it, to which it begins to move on its own. Just as it stops moving, the walls begin to open up into a long, dark hallway. This isn't explained until the second movie, but this is actually the entrance to Hell and the home of the Cenobites. Kirsty begins down the hallway, following the sounds of what seemed to be a baby. The noise gets louder and louder until she runs into a fleshy monster called the Engineer. Kirsty runs as fast as she can to escape from the Engineer, but the homemade cart he's built on top of has a pretty strong production assistant pushing it, so Kirsty is barely able to escape before the wall of her room closes to Hell once again. She tries her best to undo the cube, but before she can, the Order of the Gnash shows up. That being Chatterer, Butterball, the female Cenobite, she doesn't have a name for some reason, I don't know, and the one and only OG Aura Farmer himself, Pinhead. All of this is accompanied by our next track titled The Cenobites. Within his first minute of dialogue, Pinhead says some of my favorite lines in any horror movie ever. He's just so freaking cool, man. Kirsty begs that she didn't mean to solve the cube, but the Cenobites don't care. The only way for this to end is for Kirsty to join them in Hell. Pinhead tells Kirsty not to cry as it is a waste of good suffering. I don't know how to fit this into the video, but that line is just too cool not to include. Kirsty comes up with a good idea and rats out Frank. She offers to lead the Cenobites to Frank, and in return, they let her live. They agree on terms that Kirsty doesn't cheat them, because if she does,
We'll tear your soul apart.
back at the house, Julia and Frank agree that the jig is up and that they have to make their move tonight. They need one more victim so Frank can get a new set of skin, and because of the circumstances, they only have one option. Larry comes home to a stone-faced Julia, who tells him that she has something to show him. She turns to lead the way with the track titled In Love's Name, once again playing. Back at the hospital, Steve stands in Kirsty's empty room with the medical staff having no clue where she went. At the house again, we see Larry covered in blood and acting weird. But hey, being weird is kind of a prerequisite for this movie, right? Kirsty finally makes it to the house and is greeted by none other than the queen of bitches herself, Julia. Kirsty demands to see her father, and when she finally does, she's overjoyed as the whole time she thought he was going to be killed. She finally warns her father about Frank in the attic, but he says he already found out and killed Frank himself. Kirsty can't believe how casually her father is talking about killing his own brother, and she starts to suspect that something is wrong. We also get the track Resurrection, setting the scene once again. Kirsty demands to see the body, and Julia reluctantly takes her up to the attic where a smoking corpse sits in the middle of the room. Before she realizes it, Kirsty is locked in the attic by Julia. And as if things couldn't get any worse, the Cenobites decide that now is the time to show back up. Pinhead demands that Kirsty brings in the man that killed Frank. But with that being her father, she refuses and runs out the door that was literally just locked. As she escapes, The Cenobites plays once again, setting the last act of the movie into play. Kirsty is stopped by Julia, who she has to fight off just to reach her dad. She tries to explain that they need to leave, but he tells her not to worry. But says something that Kirsty recognizes.
Come to Daddy.
It turns out that this isn't actually Larry, but Frank wearing Larry's skin. That charred corpse in the attic was actually Kirsty's father. Actor Andrew Robinson, who plays Larry in the film, does an amazing job of playing two separate characters, with such different mannerisms, expressions, and forms of speech that it's almost hard to believe that this is the same guy. With her dreadful realization, Kirsty tries to run back upstairs but is grabbed by Julia. Just as Frank is about to kill her, Kirsty spins out of the way, making Frank stab Julia in the stomach. Frank consumes her blood like he did so many times before, showing how little he really cared for her. In her final moments, Julia really knew how bad she messed up. Looking for a place to hide, Kirsty ducks into the room across from the attic where she hides behind a bunch of old furniture. Frank makes his way into the room but doesn't find her. Just when Kirsty thinks she's safe, one of the bodies falls out of the darkness from behind her. Barely able to hold in a scream, she escapes back out into the stairway when Frank comes out of his favorite place, the attic. Stumbling back into the room where it all started, Kirsty breaks down crying next to her father's body. Frank comforts her and tells her not to worry because Uncle Frank is here. Our next track, titled Seduction and Pursuit, begins to play as the walls start to shake and a blue light shines into the room. In an instant, the Cenobites arrive and the room starts to warp and change. Chains and other forms of torture fill the room. Realizing Kirsty set him up, Frank tries to take her out once and for all, but before he can, the same chains that killed him the first time fly out of the walls and hook him. In his final moments, Frank gives an absolutely chilling line.
Jesus wept.
Kirsty again tries to escape the house, but is stopped on the stairs by the female Cenobite who tears at the walls, making them bleed. That's metal as fuck. Running back into the attic, the room has changed again, with a hospital bed against one of the walls, with Julia's body laid out on top of it. Kirsty sees that in Julia's hands is the cube and grabs it in hopes of sending the Cenobites back to hell. Pinhead appears behind her, but she solves the cube just in time and zaps Pinhead out of this world. The house starts falling apart as Kirsty zaps the female Cenobite and runs downstairs. Outside, Steve hears the commotion and breaks in through the back door to help her. Rounding a corner, Kirsty runs into Chatterer, wearing a bridal veil for some reason, and he tries to grab her, but she's able to break free and zap another Cenobite back to hell. Steve finally finds Kirsty, but doesn't notice Butterball sneaking up behind him. Right before he kills Steve, Butterball is crushed by falling rubble from the ceiling. He doesn't even get zapped to hell, he just dies. Steve grabs Kirsty and heads for the door, but the cube starts moving again, causing Kirsty to think something else is happening. She tries to stop Steve from opening the door, but it's too late. But luckily, there's nothing there. Psych! The engineer from earlier is back and ready to party. Kirsty is tired of all this shit and starts fighting back to grab the cube that she dropped when the engineer charged them. She gets the cube and there's this funny scene of Steve trying to help before Kirsty pushes him out of the way like, bitch, fuck out of the way! She solves the cube, defeating the engineer and saving both of them. The couple walks outside into the rain and watch as the house burns down into rubble. Stepping towards the raging fire, Kirsty throws the cube into the inferno. A figure appears on the other side of the fire, bringing with them our final track of the film titled Another Puzzle. To Kirsty's horror, the homeless guy from earlier walks into the fire and grabs the cube. His skin melts away and he turns into a giant bone dragon that flies away with the cube. The camera zooms out and we see the cube in the possession of the same man who originally sold the cube to Frank, ready to start the cycle all over again. The dragon's name is Derelict the Puzzle Guardian, and from what I can tell, doesn't really have anything to do with the movie. Maybe there's more context in the books. You guys will have to let us know in the comments. This is one of my all-time favorite horror films, and Pinhead's probably my favorite horror monster, because he's not really a villain, he's more of a monster. But without further ado, let's get on to the Staff Stars, where we here at The Sound of Fear let you know what we thought about the movie. For Hellraiser, we have our ratings as follows. Combined, we give the movie just about 4 stars. We want to thank you all so much for watching, and we hope you enjoyed the movie and the amazing score that supported it. And as always, we'll see you guys next time.